So having watched the Zwift Academy 2023 finals on Eurosport last week, I thought it would be an interesting video to make to see why Lewis ended up winning and why potentially the others didn't win. And obviously, having competed in the academy myself, I was curious to see how I stacked up against the eventual finalists and potentially what needs to be done to qualify for the finals next year. If I'm going to qualify, what I potentially need to do. But yeah, I was already looking them up on Strava before the final episode came out. So even though it was potentially an unexpected result of the winner, the eventual winner, I was already quite curious about some of the athletes and thought I'd be making a video. So so I'll be digging into the data that I kind of pulled from the different athletes' Strava accounts. They're all pretty good about having their Zwift Academy workouts all online. For the finals themselves, on the training camp, the absentee bit bit smoke and mirrors, like not being super transparent with the data, but obviously you've got the academy workouts publicly available for Matteo, Lewis, and Anton. So lots of good data from that, and then trying to understand what data is available from the actual training camps in the YouTube series, and then try to put that into a spreadsheet to try and analyze the free athletes and like I say, see how I stacked up compared to them as well. What I've got in the top few rows is the actual Zwift Academy workout. So if you did them yourselves, you'll know that there were specific test intervals that we ended up doing. So there was 30-second max power, 30-second fatigued max power. So after doing a session, same for 2 minutes, fresh and fatigued, and then some all-out effort. So a 5-minute, 8-minute, and 30-minute. These were all fatigued, but obviously we're all doing the same workouts, so it kind of balances out. So they're still really meaningful bits of data. So yeah, pulled these from the Stravas and rounded them a bit. You could say that the athletes were pretty well, pretty even across the board, like it said in the series, that they, in terms of the workouts, they were on a pretty level playing field. So first of all, the weights of the athletes. So Matteo and Lewis both around 68 kilograms for the workouts and for the finals, and then Anton being the slightly lighter athlete at 62 kilograms. So also compare the watts per kilo in this next table here. But yeah, Lewis and Matteo very similar across the board, being the same weight, their numbers being very similar. Just highlighted in red here, potential underperformance, where Lewis only did 430 watts for that fatigued 8 minutes. Obviously, it's still good. I don't know, that was the one place where I potentially underperformed compared to my other efforts. Underperforming in one regard doesn't discount you as an athlete, but then also I'd say he very much overperformed in the 30-minute test where he did 425 watts. So yeah, definitely balanced out. But yeah, just comparing to Matteo, you see he's a bit lower on the 8-minute, but then again higher on that 30-minute power. And then for Anton, being the slightly lighter athlete, you'd expect these powers to be slightly lower, which they are, for pretty much all the intervals. But then when you compare the watts per kilo, maybe slightly higher in some of them. In the 2 minutes, he definitely didn't perform as well, I'd say, in terms of watts per kilo. But then, yeah, the other ones, the 5-minute tests, all very much similar watts per kilo for the free athletes, apart from these standout underperformance and potential overperformance from Lewis there. 2 races that ended up happening. I don't think the data from the races is super meaningful, I'd say. Yeah, just a bit all over the place, and depends who you were up against. But yeah, decent performances across the board, but nothing stand out really. The thing that I noticed very early on was that for Matteo, it seemed like he set his FTP in Zwift quite low. So that meant for pretty much so for the fatigued 30-second and fatigued 2-minute, as well as all of these other tests, those were dependent on a workout you did in Zwift prior to those efforts, which that workout was dependent on your FTP. So if you set your FTP quite low in Zwift, then obviously that workout's going to be easier, and you're going to be fresher for the test effort. And it looked like Matteo had set his FTP quite a bit lower compared to what I think his FTP actually is. Obviously doing a 30-minute max effort at 410 watts, you'd expect an FTP of around 390 based off the 20-minute rule. But yeah, I reckon he had his FTP set to around 360, whereas Lewis looked like he set his FTP at a more honest value of what it actually was, in around 420 watts. I don't think he was at 420 watts in ability, but that's what he set it as. So obviously his workout prior to those efforts was going to be significantly harder. Yeah, Anton's was, I reckon, around 350, but that being expected, being the slightly lighter athlete. But yeah, that was something I picked up early on, that it was a bit weird that Matteo had set his FTP quite low. Across the board, very good performances from all the athletes, including Matteo, despite his potential sandbagging his earlier sessions. But yeah, like still, obviously his efforts stood out so much that he was chosen to compete in the finals. Yeah, I've also got my data and Zach Neer's data. So Zach Neer being a kind of an esports pro, where he rides a lot indoors and does competitions on MyWhoosh and Zwift, and he posted his workouts online, and obviously his numbers were super good, and he had some standout ones with the 3 finalists. None of them had like those very strong anaerobic efforts, whereas Zach had a really nice 30-second power. Potentially underperformed in the 2-minute. He had this really nice 30-second punch, I'd say, and then just pretty good results across the board. That in terms of watts per kilo, you'd not quite up there with the finalists for the longer efforts, but yeah, still a very good performance from him. He was probably potentially on the short list to make the finals, whereas if you compare like my watts per kilo, like yes, I was in terms of most of the efforts, I was significantly lower than the athletes. Like in terms of raw numbers, like I was definitely up there, very similar to what Matteo and Lewis were producing, maybe doing slightly better in certain efforts, but yeah, obviously being 15 kilograms heavier, yeah, it's not surprising that I didn't make the cut. Yeah, I've come up with some potentially for next year. I'll be slightly lighter based on just naturally coming down in weight. I'm not going to force it off, but yeah, thinking about what sort of numbers I might want to be aiming to hit to potentially make the cut for the finals next year. But yeah, these are just throwing some numbers out there, and so yeah, this would be trying to get my watts per kilo more in line with what the finalists were doing. But yeah, we'll just have to see next year. Now, moving on to the numbers produced by the finalists on the finals training camp. Like I said, Alpecin were a bit closed off with the revealing of the numbers, so I had to kind of dig into what they were saying and do my own calculations to work out what was going on. But there was a couple of key things they ended up doing. So they were doing some lactate testing, so doing an effort and then pricking the skin, taking a lactate reading to estimate FTP threshold zones based off of that. So yeah, LT1 and LT2, and then they also did some 4-minute efforts after the lactate testing on day 1, and then 4-minute efforts after the lactate testing, 4-minute efforts just after a ride on the final day. So those were the key bits of data that they took. Now for the lactate testing, I think it's important to understand what zones we're working with here. So there's kind of the two typical models that are typically used. So there's a 3 zone model, and then the 5, 6, 7 zone model, the with more zones. So I'd say this is typically the overlap you'd expect to see. So you've got these for the 3 zone model. We have zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and they're defined by these different thresholds. So LT1 and LT2, and that's all to do with the level of lactate in the blood. So when lactate first starts rising, that's known as LT1, and then when lactate starts rising more significantly, that's known as as LT2. As cyclists, a lot of us don't do lactate testing where we calculate zones based off of our FTP, and this is typically a 5 to 7 zone model. The 5 to 7 is literally if you just define VO2 max as one zone, so anything above VO2 max, or if you try and break that down a little bit more, if you want to be specific with what's anaerobic and what's neuromuscular. So yeah, I'd say this diagram here is for a more typical athlete, maybe for myself. So I'd say so the way we'd calculate a 5 zone model, what we do is we'd calculate our FTP based off doing a 20-minute max effort and taking 95% of that to estimate our FTP. Now, typically, what this is going to do is it's going to overestimate our FTP. So what people have set as their FTP, most of 99% of the population can't hold their FTP for an hour. So what they could actually hold for an hour would be significantly lower. So that's potentially where the issue of the 7 zone model comes in. So I'd say for me, maybe the upper end of what my calculated zone 2 is goes past my first lactate threshold. Then my zone 3, my tempo is in between is comfortably in between the two threshold values. But then my LT2 is probably midway between my threshold. So the upper end of my zone 4 being what my calculated FTP is based off a 20-minute test, but my actual LT2 is a bit lower because, like I say, that 20-minute test is an overestimate. So yeah, LT2 is not necessarily the same as zone 4 because just because of how we typically calculate those zones. So just having that in mind. But yeah, this will definitely change between athletes. So for certain athletes where they're extremely efficient and they are able to hold their FTP for an hour, then it would be the case that their zone 3 and their zone 4 is below is their zone 2 in a free zone model. But yeah, like I say, for most athletes, what we set as our FTP is going to be above our LT2. Now, for the lactate testing they were doing on the camp, I think they were definitely working in a free zone model and trying to make sure that they were operating within zone 2, so not surpassing that LT2 threshold. So what they do is they did 3 6-minute intervals, which are quite short, especially for threshold efforts, and they did them at 5, 5.5, and 6 watts per kilo. And they said that for all 3 athletes at 6 watts per kilo, nothing was happening. So that means that they weren't surpassing their LT2. They weren't seeing that significant spike in lactate. So you could say that their LT2 was below that power that they were producing. So on the upper end, like maybe 6.5 watts per kilo. Looking at the numbers, so for Mattia and Lewis being the same weight, started off at 340, 375, and then 410, and saying that those are all below their LT2. So which isn't impossible. Same for Anton, and they were saying for Anton maybe his lactate threshold was LT2 is even higher than that. These values were obviously extremely good, but yeah, there potential issues with being such short efforts, like in the same way you can fudge the 20-minute test and have the VO2 max side of things come into effect, being a very short effort. Maybe it's the same. I'm not too sure about that, but these 3 athletes, I think it makes more sense for these to actually be quite accurate, because they're not these VO2 max monsters. They're all these extremely aerobic athletes that are more suited towards those efforts, and that's why potentially the 4-minute testing wasn't a good display to differentiate between them. So I reckon for their FTP is probably around 420, 410, and 370, maybe on the higher end, but I'd just be guessing at that stage. Now the 420 for Mattia actually comes from a really good Strava performance he did, where he did 440 watts for 20 minutes, and just taking the 95% rule that gives a 420 watt FTP. And like I said, that 20% rule for typical athletes doesn't really work. It's not very accurate. But maybe for Mattia being a super aerobically efficient athlete, that 20%, that 95% rule actually applies. So with their thresholds being potentially quite similar, it seemed like it all came down to this 4-minute test that they were doing. Obviously, it wouldn't be like that. They'd take everything into account. Yes, they played it up for the drama. That Anton wasn't working at all in the Zwift race, but maybe he didn't try very hard in that Zwift race. Yeah, it's just speculation there. You can't really tell. But yeah, doing this, I guess it all came down to this 4-minute test, which they did on the first day after doing the 6-minute efforts. So they did the 3x6 minute at based on what the Christophs were saying. This is below their LT2, so in that zone 3 to zone 4 range. So taking that into account, it's not a significant load. Doing 18 minutes at pure threshold, so at zone 4, that's not a crazy amount of training, especially compared to the academy workouts we were doing. So yeah, 18-minute tempo to threshold, and then doing a 4-minute effort. So it wasn't super fatigued. And then on the 4th day, that effort was just after a long ride, so 3.5, 4 hours or so. It wasn't a huge amount of fatigue. Maybe everyone, they either did as well as they did in the academy workouts, but not like a crazy amount better, I'd say. It wasn't like anyone stood out from how much better they did online. So yeah, looking at the watts per kilo, Matteo and Lewis very similar, and then potentially Anton in terms of watts per kilo, the slightly better athlete, and that's why in the final episode he was a bit irate at the fact that he didn't win, being that he had the best numbers, but yeah, his watts per kilo, yes, they were better, but not significantly better really. And on a shorter effort, like what's typically watts per kilo don't matter as much, and pure watts, yes, his pure watts aren't very far off the other two athletes, but they're not like a crazy amount better. Yeah, like what's like they said, watts per kilo really on everything. And if his watts per kilo on a really long effort was significantly better, then he's obviously that climbing type. But just based on the data we have, they weren't a crazy amount better. Lewis had the standout performance on the 30-minute Zwift Academy test, and Mattia has done a extremely strong 20-minute effort. So not saying that Anton can't produce a really long high watts per kilo effort, but from the data we have, he hasn't really shown that. So not, even though they for the drama's sake, they made it as though Anton was the superior athlete. There really wasn't much in it, and in my opinion, and it was a pretty level between the three athletes at this stage. Yeah, so like I said, with maybe watts per kilo not being as significant for those shorter efforts, something that according to Lantern Rouge, teams are valuing a lot more these days is something called compound score, which is taking the absolute power for a 5-minute effort multiplied by the watts per kilo for the same effort, for that effort, and then taking this score to judge an athlete rather than your typical judgment based off FTP, because like I say, on the shorter efforts, the watts per kilo may be less significant, and the pure watts being more important. So I estimated their 5-minute efforts based off of the 5-minute efforts they produced during the academy, and obviously these 4-minute efforts. So this was a 5-minute fatigued effort, so you'd expect they'd be able to produce a little bit more power, and then same for these being a 4-minute effort, but yeah, they were fatigued. And like I said, I feel like they potentially underperformed in all of these 4-minute efforts, considering how hard this 5-minute the session leading up to this 5-minute effort were, which is potentially why Matteo did had the advantage from setting his FTP lower compared to like Lewis, setting his FTP more realistically. I estimate around 500 watts for Lewis and Matteo, and then maybe 480 for Anton, based on his 4 minute. But then taking the compound score, 3700, 3700, 3800, like it's not like Anton was standing out as he is the superior athlete by far. He was very much similar between the three athletes at this stage. So there was, and like, yes, we don't know the behind the scenes of what was going on, and so I think it makes sense why they'd pick a different athlete based off other factors. So then just taking everything into account, like at the end of the day, age is a factor, and from what we've seen, all Lewis and Matteo produced very similar numbers, but Lewis being 5 years younger, there is room to grow for that. Obviously, there's room to grow for Mattia, and hopefully he'll go on to have a successful career as well. But five additional years in the bank, like potentially you'd pick Lewis over Matteo, and depending on how much they dug into the Zwift Academy workouts as well, the fact that Lewis completed all the workouts at a higher intensity before those efforts, and produced very similar power numbers to what Matteo did. Like, it's not a no-brainer, but you could say that Lewis's performance was better, and then obviously repeated this at the academy. Matteo didn't really get the chance to show his skills of being that longer sustained efforts, but Lewis had also shown that he's able to produce those longer efforts. In terms of Anton, like I said, potentially the best athlete in terms of watts per kilo, but watts per kilo not being everything, and potentially the pros nowadays, the pro teams nowadays valuing other factors instead of that. So then they were happy to go with the slightly heavier rider that produces more watts in Lewis, and obviously Anton was 24 years old as well. So it wasn't like everyone saying, they just picked the weakest rider just because he was younger. Like, there was benefits to all three athletes, and it was quite funny reading the comments after each video. Like, I thought I'd spoiled myself early on, because originally I was seeing all comments, we already know Matteo's won this, and then everyone's saying, we already know that Anton's won this, he's got the best outright numbers. And then there was also people saying, they're just going to pick the younger guy. But it wasn't that they just picked the younger guy. Like, yes, I think that was definitely a deciding factor, but it was because Lewis was able to hold his own, produce similar numbers to the other two, but then being 5 years younger than them, having that potential room to grow. Definitely a deserved win from Lewis, but Anton and Matteo being brilliant athletes in their own right. So kudos to them as well. If I make the finals of Zwift Academy next year, so I'm assuming it was done in around January. So we completed our final workout start of December, assuming they had a few weeks off, and then did the training camp in January. So I will be 24 years old if I make it to the finals. So being the same as Lewis and same as Matteo and Anton this year, where they obviously didn't win because there was a really young buck who was able to hold his own with them. So if I'm going to make it to the finals and do well, like the numbers will need to speak for themselves. Definitely want to do Zwift Academy this year though. So after 6 months of racing, I'm really excited to see like how much I'll have improved throughout the year, and obviously I've got my numbers from last year to target as throughout the year, and try and improve on those, and then hopefully really surpass them in Zwift Academy. But we'll just have to see, and not take it too seriously. Like obviously Zwift Academy, it's a great pathway, but it's not the only way to make it pro. So I just want to do the best I can racing this year, and improve my numbers, improve my skill, get a tactical mind for being in the races, and just go from there. But hopefully this was a sort of interesting insight. Obviously I just pulled these numbers from my own interest, and wanted to see what sort of numbers I needed to be producing if I was to make it there as well. But yeah, definitely wasn't there this year, but I'm glad, because without any racing experience, it wouldn't have been right to be there. But yeah, next year, after hopefully a whole season of racing under my belt, like I'll be able to hold my own if I made it there. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video.